Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we remember. In the second half of our program, Rick Green from the Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance helps us remember the critical votes of our state legislators on Beacon Hill, many of whom apparently prefer to operate more opaquely. Up first, commemorating Veterans Day, we're pleased to welcome Andrew Carroll from the Legacy Project, whose collection of over 100,000 war letters helps us remember the sacrifices made by our men and women in uniform from the Revolutionary War to today. Andy, welcome to the show.
Great to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Andy, what is the Legacy Project?
The Legacy Project is something I began back in 1998, and it was really inspired by a fire that swept through our house in Washington, D.C. Everything we had was destroyed, and nobody was hurt, which is obviously the most important thing. But all of those, those irreplaceable family possessions were gone forever.
Photographs, letters, whatever, yeah.
Exactly. And just by happenstance, I was talking to some veterans and just saying, what do you guys do with your old memorabilia from the war? And they said, we threw it all away. And even though I was never a history buff, I don't come from a military family, it just seemed that we were losing something as a nation. And so just through word of mouth, veterans from, whether it was Vietnam or World War II, Korea, the Gulf War, started sending me letters that they had written, and so that I could sort of preserve them for posterity. And almost on a whim, I wrote to Dear Abby, who had been writing a lot on veterans issues, and I said, I want to launch a project officially, to encourage Americans to seek out and preserve war correspondences, even if they didn't want to send them to me. If they just wanted to hold on to them, just like, please don't throw them away.
Yeah, pull it out of the attic and save them for posterity.
Exactly. And so I really had no idea just the power of Dear Abby, because when this column ran, it was Veterans Day of 1998, it's like the floodgates opened. And I started receiving literally tens of thousands of war letters from all over the country. And these included like every conflict in our nation's history. So, dating back to handwritten missives from the revolution. And now today, because the project is ongoing, we have emails from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I've been collecting all these correspondences. It's now well over 100,000. And I realized that the time had come to get them to a real archive that could
proper
preserve
repository.
them. And real curators who make sure to take care of them. So I kind of fell in love with this university out in California called Chapman. And they had actually suggested doing a play, because they have this wonderful theater department, based on not just the letters, but my journey. I've gone to 40 countries around the world, including Iraq and Afghanistan, to meet with U.S. troops and to encourage other countries to do the same and to preserve their war letters. And so I said to the chancellor here, I want to donate this collection somewhere. If I were to pick Chapman, would you really take care of these letters? He said, listen, you give us these letters, not only will we, preserve them, but we will create a whole institute out of this. And that's what's now the Center for American War Letters, as we call ourselves. And so he was very proactive about, he's like, look, I want you on the road. I want you collecting more letters. I want this to be the largest collection of war letters in the world. And so I'm gallivanting across the country, going to all 50 states.
So these are now available to scholars who can look at certain eras or certain themes and go through that material in great detail and tell us more about ourselves.
And that's the next step. I'm literally just now giving them the letters. So what we want to do is catalog them, digitize them, make them available online, so you can search in Gettysburg or combat or any kind of theme or battle, and these letters will pop up and be accessible. So that's kind of phase 2. So I'm just now at the point of getting them the letters. Again, it's well over 100,000, and to continue spreading the word. There are young troops coming back from Iraq and from Afghanistan, and people think they don't write letters anymore. Of course, they do emails mostly, but some of them still handwrite letters, and it's really great to see this new generation of writers and what their experiences have been and what they've been witnesses to.
So I would think Google would be interested in something like this.
It's interesting. They've never approached us, and we've certainly gotten a bit of media attention throughout the years. And there are other institutes that have come to us saying we want the letters, but I really love the Chapman community. And the things that these letters contain is just so riveting. We have a letter that begins, "Dear Sis, it's 9:05 a.m. Sunday morning. The bombs have been falling for an hour now. I'm trapped here in the forward engine room of this ship." You look at the upper right-hand corner, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, USS New Orleans. This
chilling.
Young sailor, William Seiko, was inside a ship at Pearl Harbor as the attack was happening, and he miraculously survived, which is, of course, how we have his letter, and he made it through the war and so forth. And just a week ago, as I was coming through the South on this big trip across the country, I met with a young woman who gave me a 15-page handwritten letter she wrote after surviving 9/11. And her description, her narrative is so similar to the young sailor at Pearl Harbor. And that's the thing, you see these echoes and patterns over time of people who are right there in the eye of the storm.
Well, work a few themes for us, if you can sort of squint your eyes and extract from across all the years. And let's start with one. To what extent does the horror of war come through in these letters?
That's what struck me the most, is because I thought with censorship, which really was only in World War I and World War II, Korea, Vietnam, other wars, the troops were not censored. So I really kind of assumed that the world wars would not be very descriptive because they knew they just couldn't, get away with
the home front.
Yeah. The opposite turned out to be true. They are among the most graphic and for lack of a better word, riveting letters I've ever read, because they are talking about various combat that they've been into, whether it's at Battle of the Bulge or D-Day or Market Garden, these famous battles that many of us are familiar with, and they're giving that personal view of what it felt like, the firsthand thing. And these are not the words the generals and the presidents far away. This is the young guy who's in a foxhole, who are in a trench in World War I, describing gas attacks and the first use of tanks and warplanes and warfare. And so it really does give you that very human scale of and we have letters. One letter, which is you just look at it and you gasp, has a bullet hole right through the middle of it. It was a young soldier at Anzio. He put it in his backpack. Actually, ironically, describing a very close call he had when a shell dropped right next to him and failed to explode. And then he puts that letter in his backpack. It's shot through the back. He survived, fortunately. But you look at this thing and you can see the burn marks and the hole right through the center of the letter. And whether it's Civil War letters that are flecked with mud and blood, or letters from Vietnam where the ink is all streaked because it was written in a rainstorm, the letters themselves show the conditions under which these men and women were serving.
Andy, as you read these letters, and of course they take place in different wars, different eras, different cultures, to what extent do you see a belief in the cause coming through from the soldiers or a questioning of that cause?
It's interesting because I've had many troops tell me that they're not really fighting for a cause. They're fighting for the person next to them, that they get home alive, and that, of course, that this individual gets home alive to their family as well. But you really do see in various conflicts, troops writing about what they're fighting for. In fact, one of the letters that really inspired this whole project was written by a distant cousin of mine. He was, much older. He's a World War II veteran. And he sent me the letter, and the very first line, writing to his wife, "Dear Betty Ann, I saw something today that makes me realize why we're fighting this war." And he goes on in very explicit detail about walking through Buchenwald, the Nazi concentration camp, and saying this is what we were fighting for, to stop this evil, even though many of the troops did not know about what was going on until the end of the war. And the same thing with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There were troops who felt like, look, we are fighting for our country. But it is true that you do see, most of all, a sense of camaraderie, that the troops are fighting to ensure that their men or women, get home alive. But I do love the letters that are very reflective and that get very philosophical, and letters of faith, letters of, questioning. In Vietnam, you do start seeing them question, what is this war about? What are we doing here? But then you also see that in Korea, too, and you see this in Iraq. And so it's not just limited to any one conflict. But that's the thing, is even with censorship, the troops are incredibly thoughtful and profound. And, one of the things that's always impressed me is just how intelligent and how articulate these men and women are. And some of them are just kids. These are 18, 19-year-old service members. And they're writing on, some of the largest issues you can imagine. Again, like issues of faith, and where is God in the midst of these conflicts? And some see God's work in the courage and the bravery of those they're serving with, and some just see the horror of war and wonder, how can there be a higher being that lets this happen?
Andy, do you have a concern that somehow this archive could be used to glorify war?
I would say that the people who write the most emphatically about the sheer horror of warfare are those who've seen it firsthand. They do not come out of it glorifying it, romanticizing it. They've held people in their arms who've died. You have letters by war nurses and surgeons who just talk about the daily onslaught of tragedy and of these young men and women dying. And it's one of the great myths, I think, of the military is that those who serve glorify what they go through. The men and women who've actually seen combat on a regular basis really don't see anything that's glorious in it. Now, they will talk about, again, the courage and the bravery of the men and women that they serve with, and that there's nobility in that. But war itself, you really don't see them in any way making light of it, trivializing it, or seeing it as something really wonderful, because it isn't.
So, Andy, reading all these letters must have opened your eyes. You said earlier that you didn't start out to be a student of history, but you certainly become one. Where have you gone with this?
So the War Letters Project is my priority. That's what I focus most of my time and effort on. But I've started working on a similar effort called Here is Where. And the whole point is to find unmarked but significant historic sites across the country. So these are the places, whether they're parking lots or garages or taverns or an alleyway,
forgotten,
that you walk by every day, and there's no plaque or marker, but something amazing happened there. And this really came about because of the War Letters Project. As I'm reading through, all these different conflicts over, the generations, I'm coming across stories I've never heard about. Just one quick example. Everybody knows the Titanic. It's, there have been hundreds of movies and films and books, etc. Very few people have ever heard of the Sultana. This was a Civil War ship coming back at the end of the conflict in April of 1865. About 2,000 Union soldiers. These are guys who had survived Gettysburg and Andersonville and the worst of that you can imagine. They're finally going home.
Right.
As the ship it's on the Mississippi, it's rounding Memphis, it explodes. One of the steamers bursts. And about 1,700 men either are killed in the fire or drowned in the Mississippi. This is the worst maritime disaster in our history, far worse than the Titanic. And yet it's very few people have heard about it. So I'm reading about this, in a Civil War letter. It just got me looking for more of these types of stories. And so I went to the site in Memphis where this happened. There's no plaque or marker. The story that really inspired this project, though, also happened during the Civil War. It was in about 1864. A young man was standing at a railroad platform in New Jersey, and he slipped, and he fell between the train and the platform. The conductor didn't see him and signaled for the train to move ahead, and this young man was almost crushed under the wheels, almost died. At the very last second, another man rushed over, pulled him to safety. The man who fell and almost died was Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of the president. The man who rescued him was Edwin Booth, brother of John Wilkes.
Oh, wow.
A year before the assassination, you have a Booth saving the life of a Lincoln. And I thought when I heard this story, it must be apocryphal. But sure enough, I come across a letter by Robert Todd Lincoln himself describing this incident second by second. It actually happened. So I went to the site it's now called the Exchange Place in Jersey City, and there are all these commuters there. The train tracks are different now, but it's the same site. And I just thinking all these commuters and tourists and people who are taking the path line have no idea that there was this incredible intersection of history back in 1864. So again, it was just, that and the Sultana really got me thinking about what other places are there around the country that have national significance, but that we just don't know about.
And how are you commemorating these sites?
Well, in many places, I want to put up a marker. So for example, there's a slave named Philip Reed who ironically built the Statue of Freedom on top of the Capitol. And he was buried in an unmarked grave, and I was able to track down exactly, where he was laid to rest, and we put up a marker there. One of my favorite stories is that much more contemporary. I found the site where the very first cell phone call was made in history. It was in New York City on 6th Avenue around 54th Street. And I got to know Marty Cooper, who's the inventor of the cell phone. He's alive and well today. And so he very kindly pinpointed the spot where he made the very first cell phone call, and we put up a marker near there. And it was really funny because I asked him, who did you call?
Who's on the other end? Right?
Yeah, this is like an Alexander Graham Bell kind of moment. And he said, I called my competitor at AT&T. So he said, hey, I'm calling you on a cell phone. And he knew exactly what that meant. And he was also, Marty was very funny because he drew a map of where he made the call, and it was on the corner of the street. And then he put an X in the middle of the street, and he said, almost got hit by a car while talking on a cell phone. So the very first cell phone call was almost Marty's last, but he made it okay. But it's just it's fun to find these places. They're not all serious. Some of them are kind of lighthearted and humorous, but they all have to have national significance.
Andy, tell us about some of your other favorites.
This one just blew my mind when I came across it because it's about the invention of penicillin. And since it was created, has literally saved, not an exaggeration, hundreds of millions of lives around the world. Now, the common perception is that it was discovered by the British, Alexander Fleming.
Right.
That's partially true. Fleming discovered it by accident.
Came in through the window.
Yeah, exactly. He had left his laboratory for a vacation, came back, and there was this mold growing in a little petri dish, and so forth. But the truth is that he never did anything with it. That was it. He had that little thing, and it was never used to help anybody.
He never purified it?
Well, no, the Brits couldn't figure out how to produce it. They could just do little petri dishes full of it. So about 10 years later, when the war was starting, they knew that they needed an antibiotic to help the mass number of casualties that were inevitable in every war. And so the British scientists were frantically trying to mass produce it. They couldn't do it. So they called this little laboratory in Peoria, Illinois. And the two of the British scientists flew to Illinois. They brought the mold and the specimens and so forth. And it was at that laboratory that the Americans figured out how to mass produce it, thus saving, again, hundreds of millions of lives.
When was this?
So this is back in the early 1940s.
Okay.
And it was they were able to produce mass quantities just in time for the D-Day invasion in 1944. And if you talk to any historian, they will talk that penicillin was actually one of the major factors of winning the war because we could put men back into service who were wounded. The Germans couldn't do that. So it was a huge discovery. But what the coda to the story that I absolutely love is that Fleming's original penicillin was pretty strong and definitely worked. But the Americans wanted something that was much more powerful. So they asked the Army Corps of Engineers, as you guys are going around the world, we want you to send us every kind of mold you come across, whether it's old cheese, dirt, meats, whatever. So they were collecting this really disgusting array of kind of molds at this lab. Nothing really worked. Then one day, one of the lab assistants went down to a local grocery store just to do shopping in Peoria, saw a cantaloupe with a little bit of fuzz on it. I mean, we've all seen this, when we're shopping.
Sure.
Brought it back to the lab. That became the progenitor of all penicillin made throughout the world for several decades.
This is the precursor to high-throughput screening, which is how most of our drugs have been discovered.
Yeah, exactly. And it's amazing all the little coincidences that were, Fleming discovering it by mistake, the British scientists actually coming across an article about Fleming's discovery 10 years earlier and being like, wait a minute, we should probably contact this guy. And then with the melon that has the mold on it. So it's just one of these things where, again, we don't even know the names of the doctors who discovered penicillin beyond Fleming, and they have saved more lives than probably anyone else in the history of the world. So those are the types of stories I really love because they show our ingenuity, our resourcefulness, our creativity, and that these places exist all across the country.
Take us back in history a little bit. I just looking through the material I read before I got you on the air. I read about a woman named Ona Judge. Tell us about her.
Ona Judge, incredible woman from New Hampshire. She was not from New Hampshire. She moved to New Hampshire, and she was a slave. And this is back in the 1700s. Who literally walked out the front door of her master's house in Philadelphia, got on a ship that was headed to New Hampshire, and really set up a life for herself as a free woman. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act was still in effect, and so technically she could have been captured and brought back to Philadelphia. What's amazing about Ona Judge is that her master, the person she was defying, was the most powerful man in the country. She was George Washington's slave. And so what she did was incredibly courageous. And, I mean, she's literally defying the president of the United States, the man who won the revolution. And the point, and I talk about this in the chapter, I'm not out to denigrate Washington. Washington was born into a family with slaves. He actually came to abhor it, spoke against it. He really evolved on the subject. But it's not a question of sort of knocking down Washington. It's about elevating this woman named Ona Judge, who was incredibly courageous. And in fact, New Hampshire's motto is live free or die. I mean, who better exemplifies that than Ona Judge?
And did you put a marker down where you found her?
No, not yet. It's on private property. So we're trying to get a marker in the town, just telling her story, like closer to the harbor where she came in, to the port, so that it'll be more visible. Her grave and the place where she lived is on private property in the middle of the woods, and so nobody would ever see it if we put a marker there. But we could at least tell that, this is a woman from Portsmouth who had lived her life.
And lived the dream of liberty.
Exactly, in the name of liberty, exactly.
How about some immigrant stories? Anything from the great waves of immigration?
Another one of my favorite characters is a gentleman named Dr. Joseph Goldberger. And if you say the word pellagra, probably the vast majority of Americans, myself included, had no idea what that is. He wiped out that disease. It's a
lost disease of history.
Exactly. And it was killing a lot of people in the South in particular, and many people thought that it was some sort of, contamination in the food. And he figured out that it was a vitamin deficiency. And he actually tested himself to prove this point. And I won't even go into detail because what he did was so disgusting, and what he ingested to prove to people that that's not what's causing it. But he was an immigrant from what was back then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he came to America, and he is actually someone who did have a marker put up near where he did his experiments. It was knocked down and lost. And so that's a place that I want to get remarked. And it was just that I explored that aspect of history of how sometimes there are markers put up, but whether it's vandalism or because people are opposed to this person. In this case, many people think that it's because he was Jewish, but he's just this really incredible character who, again, saved many, many lives through his discoveries. And a lot of the people that I've come across said that the inventor of the first car in America was actually an electric car. And this is this incredible man from Iowa who had come from Scotland. And, these places and these people are all around us. The one thing that I love most is talking with students, because I was, back in high school, the one who was absolutely bored by history. It just seemed like it was all about memorizing dates and places.
And generals and kings and not regular people.
Exactly. And that, that these stories are literally all around us. And I think that just by even realizing that, it changes how we see the world and hopefully incites a sense of passion. And that's the thing that I most want to do is, I love working on these projects, whether it's, finding the war letters and bringing attention to our veterans and our troops, or discovering these unmarked sites across America. It is so exhilarating to do this, and I want others to feel that same sense of passion and enthusiasm.
Andy, it sounds like you found your calling. How can people learn more?
The simplest thing is just to go to our website, warletters.us, warletters.us. It's got our address, my email, and everything, and people who have stories to share or letters, we'd love to know about it, and they can get in touch with me directly.
Andy, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for helping us spread the word.
That was Andrew Carroll, founder of the Legacy Project and author of a book called War Letters, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. To send us comments or feedback on this or any of our past shows, visit realclearradio.org and click on the email Bill link. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, one of America's top political websites. Sure came in handy this week. Ahead, Rick Green from the Mass Fiscal Alliance describes his efforts to hold legislators' feet to the fire and the ferocious pushback he's gotten from incumbents who prefer to keep their voting records out of the public eye. Stay tuned.